And you want to come say hi? No, I think everyone's dying to see you. They're way more excited to see you than me. Just saying. Okay. If you want to see many, you come on Shabbos. Good evening, Barbara. Good evening, Medellin. I'm going to get started here in just a minute. I'm just going to share this on the platforms, and we'll be ready to roll. Good evening, Anat. Good evening, Jim. Good evening, Robin. Share. Oh, good evening, Erica from Norway. How can we do it without you? Okay, we got that. And one more. Okay, I think we covered all our bases. Okay. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is a unique Wednesday. It's the only Wednesday in the 9 days that bring us closer to Tisha B'Av. So it's the 9 days in which we refrain from joy. It's very hard for Chabad Hasidim, the 9 days, because we don't like being anything but joyous. But this is the time of year that we mourn. We don't eat meat. We don't eat poultry. We try not to overbathe. Although if you need direction in that specific one, consult me. We don't do laundry. We don't do extracurricular activities. It's the 9 days, but it's also Parshas Devarim. It's also the portion of Devarim. We begin the book of Deuteronomy, and it's apropos. And this is something that's spoken about. The Rebbe spoke about it. Others have spoken about it. The reality is that Devarim begins Moshe Rabbeinu. Moses begins his last will and testament to the Jewish people on Rosh Chodesh Shvat. So Moses passed away on Zayin Adar, on the 7th of Adar. On Rosh Chodesh Shvat, so approximately 5 weeks prior, he begins a final speech, quite the sermon, a 36-day sermon to the Jewish people. I'll come up soon. 36-day sermon to the Jewish people, and he gives them a lot of it's multifaceted. It's rebuke, and it's reminders, and it's a repetition of the mitzvahs, which is why it's called Mishnah Torah, the repetition of the Torah. But it's also, as usual in the Torah, it's always about nuance. And I think there's one thing that we see about Moshe Rabbeinu, I shouldn't say we, I think. What I've studied in the Rebbe's teaching, which I'm about to share with you, it seems like in the grandiose, in the big speeches that Moshe was giving, he didn't forget the details. He didn't forget the nuance. He didn't forget a most important aspect, which is clarity. Clarity is so important, especially when you're a leader, not just to give vague statements, but to ensure that the people that are listening to you actually know the details and with clarity what you're dealing with and what you're talking about. And I'll explain what I mean. So we're using the live Chumash that we use in the shul, this Chumash. And on page 1067, Moses is repeating to the Jewish people some of what transpired in the time in the desert. So they spent close to 40 years at this point in the desert. And Moshe says as follows, and I'm going to read a few verses to give you the context, so not just one line. I said to you, don't let your spirits be broken. Don't be afraid of them. God, your God, who goes ahead of you, will fight on your behalf, just as he did everything on your behalf in Egypt before your eyes. And as you have seen how God, your God, has carried you in the desert as a man carries his son throughout your entire journey until you arrived here. So he's reminding the Jews that God literally took care of them in the desert like a parent takes care of a baby, takes care of a toddler. But you do not believe, but you do not believe God, your God, about the statement that he promised to bring you to the land. Yet you see that God along the route ahead of you to search out a place for you in which to encamp, and he provides a pillar of fire at night to enable you to see while you travel, and a cloud of protection by day. So despite the fact that you guys don't believe, you can't run away from the fact that literally with your own eyes, you've seen him take care of you in miraculous ways, in wondrous ways. And here's where I want to get a little zoom in. God heard the sound of your comments. So in other words, Moshe is telling the Jews, God in the desert heard the negative complaints and the kvetching and the rebelliousness that you guys expressed, and he became angry. He swore, saying, not to give to your forefathers. He swore, saying, not a single man from this evil generation will see the good land, which I swore to give to your forefathers, except for Kalev, the son of Yefuneh. He will see it, and I will give him the land of Hebron, which he trod upon, to him and his children, because he followed God loyally. So far, everything sounds great. Moshe tells them, you guys are rebellious. You guys made God angry. And therefore, not a single one of you people that came out of Egypt will enter the land of Israel, except for Kalev, the son of Yefuneh, who was one of the two spies, Caleb, one of the two spies who did it right. And he will get a portion in the land of Israel. And here's where it gets interesting. You have a question? So Chaya says, what about Yeshua? What about Joshua? So for that, you have to be patient. And you'll see what we say next. I'm continuing in the order of the verses. Because of you, God also became angry with me, saying, you will not come there to the land either. So Moshe now inserts himself. He says, God said that Moshe, will also not go into the land. Why? Because of the Jews. You guys messed it up for me, and therefore I can't go to Israel either. And then he continues and says, going to Chaya's point, Joshua, son of Nun, who stands at your side, will go there, support him, for he will lead the Jewish people to inherit it. So what I address tonight, what I share with you tonight, my questions, my answers, none of it's mine. It's an incredible talk that I read from the Rebbe from for the summer of 1973. So in the summer of 1973, the Rebbe addressed this in the following way. First and foremost, we need to remind ourselves that Rashi, the preeminent Torah commentator, is there, as Rashi says himself. My role, Rashi says, is Lefaresh Pshutei Shel Mikra, to explain anything that needs to be understood in the basic understanding of the verses. Therefore, if Rashi feels like we should understand something without his commentary, he's not going to say anything. Read the verse. By the way, there's plenty of Rashis in the Torah. There's plenty of verses in the Torah where there is no Rashi, because Rashi says I don't have to explain anything. From a simplistic perspective, it's understood. Therefore, it's interesting that in our parsha, in our Torah portion, specifically in the verses that I just read, many commentators ask, really wild, what we call in Yiddish, Sturmdike. Sturmdike literally translates as storming questions, but it doesn't really translate well. It means, big questions, like rocking questions. So many of the commentators have a question that Rashi doesn't even ask. Rashi in our parsha doesn't even address it, which is odd. Why wouldn't he address it? If the other commentators are asking it, obviously, it makes sense that Rashi, who's trying to give us the basics, should address it. And going into the details, the parsha tells us at great length, Moshe is telling the Jews about the sin of the spies, right? He's telling them about the decree that was decreed against the Jews in the desert, right? Where he says clearly, the verse says, not a single man from this evil generation will see the good land, right? Because they questioned, right? In the story of the spies, the Jews questioned whether they're going to go into Israel. They listened to the spies. And he's saying, except, who's going to go into Israel? Caleb. Naturally, if you want to look at the verse naturally, the next words out of the verse should have been out of Moses' mouth, is like Chaya's point. And Joshua. Except he takes a break. And in between telling us about Caleb and telling us about Joshua, he says, and by the way, God got angry at me too because of you people, and therefore I'm not going to Israel either. First of all, you're talking about the story of the spies. You had nothing to do with the story of the spies. You were not one of the spies. You were not one of the people that accepted the spies' negative report from Israel. So why did Moshe insert himself there? And if he wanted to say, by the way, they're not going into Israel because of the story of the spies, but in addition, I'm not going into Israel because somehow I was the one that sent the spies in the first place, and therefore I'm part of that process by sending the spies. right? You remember in Numbers where it says in Parsha Shlach Lechem, God said to Moshe, send on your own. You want to send spies? They're on you. I'm not dealing with spies. I already told you Israel's good for the Jews. So you could say that Moshe wasn't involved directly, but indirectly because he sent them. But then tell it to us after you tell us that Caleb and Joshua are going in. Why take a break in between Caleb and Joshua and say, by the way, you nagging Jews, because of you, I'm not going into Israel either. Furthermore, the real reason Moses didn't go into Israel, we know, if you study the Torah, is in the book of Numbers, in Chukas, just a few weeks ago, when the Jewish people were in another state of complaining. What did they complain about? They complained about the water. They didn't have water again. There was once in the book of Numbers and once in the book of Exodus and then again in the book of Numbers. In the book of Exodus, God told Moshe to hit the rock and water came out. In the book of Numbers, they were complaining. They were in bad news, right? Let's not sugarcoat the Jews. They were part of the problem at Mei Meriba. It's called the water of conflict. That's what it was named. It wasn't just the conflict of Moses and Aaron. There's a lot of commentators about what Moses and Aaron's sin was. Was it because he spoke to the rock? Was it because, and he made the Jews look bad because he proved that even a rock would listen? If he would have spoken to the rock, he could have showed them how listening a rock was and the Jews weren't listening. Or was it because he called them Hamoyrim? He said, Shimuna Hamoyrim, listen, you rebellious ones. In other words, he spoke in a derogatory way to the Jewish people. Some say that was the sin. There's a whole litany that our Barbanel gives 10 reasons of why Moshe was sinful at the rock, what his problem was. But it doesn't take away for a moment the fact that the Jewish people on their own were also sinful at the rock. They started the whole conversation. Moshe in some way blamed them for even invoking his wrath by harassing him about the water, forcing him to go to God into the tent of the meeting and asking God about the water. And God thought. So, of course, the blame game is never an excuse just because he had someone to blame, right? And that's why God didn't accept his blame, but it doesn't take away the fact that the Jews were not behaving then. Therefore, some want to say that Moshe, referring when he says, I wasn't able to go into the land of Israel, it's talking about his reason why he couldn't go into Israel, which was the sin of hitting the rock instead of speaking to it, which makes no sense. A, why are you inserting it in the story of the spies in between Caleb and Joshua, smack in the middle? And two, it was almost a 38.5-year separation between the story of the spies and the story of the rock. The story of the spies happened right after the Jews left Egypt. That's the reason they got punished to spend 40 years in the desert. For each day that they were in Israel, there was a year in the desert. And then at the end, all the way at the end, right? Because when did the story with the rock happen? When Miriam passed away, and then we lost the special well that was connected to Miriam, which was all the way, almost at the time when Moshe was passing away and they were going to go to Israel. So 38.5 years later. So somehow Moshe lumps the two into the same statement. So first of all, it's a great question. The problem is Rashi doesn't address the question. Rashi assumes we get it. Nachmanides, the Ramban, the great Nachmanides, the 12th and 13th century Spanish commentator on the Torah, says that Moshe wanted to include it with the other sins to remind the Jews that his problem is also their problem. That not just the Jews of the Exodus didn't end up going to Israel because of the story of the spies, but even Moshe can't go to Israel. Which is a very nice approach from Rambam, but the Rebbe says, first of all, you could say that after. You have to insert it in the middle of the story. Doesn't explain why it's inserted smack in the middle of Caleb and Joshua. Number two, and it's interesting how the Rebbe takes something such a simplistic view. It says, who is he talking to? The generation that had the issue by the well was the generation that went to Israel. It was the younger generation, right? They're almost going into Israel at this point. This is the generation that the new generation of Jews, the generation from the spies, Rashi already told us that before the sin at the rock, before the hitting of the rock, they already passed. The generation that had left Egypt already passed away at that point. So he's making a concoction that doesn't even make sense chronologically, because who's he talking to? Who's he complaining to about the spies? And if he wants to blame them, you can't blame them for things they weren't around for. So you can't blame them for the spies. You can't blame the generation of the spies for the issue with the rock. So who is the association what is the association that Moses is making here with this specific group? And so the Rebbe goes through a lot of these various commentators and realizes that there are those that say that it's very interesting. I think it's the Abarbanel that yes, Moshe was punished because of hitting the rock, but it was really a combined punishment for the rock and for his part in the spy story with sending the spies. But if that's the case, I mean, you could say like Nadav and Avihu, like Aaron's two sons. There's multiple reasons for why they died when they entered the Holy of Holies. It could be more than one reason that brought about it. But is it important? In other words, if Moshe's point is that this that they sinned and therefore they shouldn't sin again, and only Joshua and Caleb are going to go into Israel. And by the way, even I'm not going into Israel. Moses, right? If that's his point, why is he emphasizing here that it's their fault that in other words, I'm not going into Israel, and it's your fault, by the way. Why is that relevant in this moment? And so the Rebbe says you could try to say that they were similar sins in a sense that we sometimes judge sins by severity. Right? There's always a term in halacha, for example, if someone is ovid avodah zarah, if someone sins with idolatry, how bad that is. And then sometimes you'll hear if certain sins are as bad as idolatry. So there is that concept with it where you're dealing with the severity of things and therefore lump things together. So you could say that Moshe was trying to emphasize that the sin of the rock was as severe as the sin of the spies, which is a pretty big statement because the sin of the spies kept the Jews in the desert for an extra 39 years, and the sin of the rock kept one guy named Moses out of Israel. And yet you're saying that the sin is comparable. Similar to like we say, there's this concept, there's a concept in Judaism of juxtaposition. One of the favorite words I learned coming out of yeshiva was juxtaposition, right? They take a bunch of guys out of Crown Heights who never barely learned English, and now we're supposed to be able to say words like juxtaposition, which now, after 20 years, I sound like I say it perfectly, but let's just say that there's plenty of non-yeshiva students who have a hard time saying words like that. But the juxtaposition is important because in Torah, we see a lot of that. So, for example, it tells us why in Parshas Chukas, when we read about the Parah Adumah, about the red heifer, how you take the ashes with hyssop from a red heifer, and you sprinkle it with water on a person that's impure. That whole story in the book of Numbers with the red heifer, and it's in juxtaposition with the story of Miriam's passing, even though the red heifer was taught to the Jewish people 2 years after they left Egypt, and Miriam died in the 39th year before they got into Israel. It was like a 37-year gap, and yet they're juxtaposed in the Torah. And the question is why? And we're taught that it's juxtaposed because just like the red heifer, like any type of offering, any type of korban, any type of sacrifice in the tabernacle, it brought atonement to the person bringing it. When a righteous Jew passes away, someone like Miriam, a righteous Jewess passes away, it brings a level of atonement to the Jewish people, which is an interesting concept in itself. I should say, I was talking about it recently. Who was I talking about it with? I was giving a class to someone somewhere recently, like in the last week, about this exact topic. And the idea being, or maybe it was one of the articles I wrote, but the point being is that because we are one organism, when you inflict pain on one part of the Jewish people, and there's sometimes no greater pain than when a righteous Jew passes away, sort of when we experience that pain, it takes away other pains that God could have inflicted upon us. So Miriam passing away is like a korban. It brings atonement for the people because we struggle and we suffer through that passing. Similar to what it says later in the book of Deuteronomy, that Moshe's rebuke was Moshe's rebuke about the breaking of the tablets is mentioned in juxtaposition with the passing of Aaron the high priest. And over there, the Talmud tells us that when a tzaddik passes away, when a righteous person passes away, it's a harsh day for the Jews, like on the day in which the tablets were broken by Moses. In other words, there is this concept that when the Jewish people experience pain, it has the potential to remove other pain. But my point over here being that juxtaposition is a real thing. So if you want to say over here that the reason why the story that Moses went in the middle of talking about the episode of the evil, wicked episode of the spies, he inserted his story with the rock, was to teach us that they have similar severity. So the Rebbe says that's a nice idea, but number one, if you look at the verses in the book of Numbers about the hitting of the rock, it's pretty severe. So gesund, Rabban, bless you. In other words, the verse in the book of Numbers, when it comes to the rock, it says, Yan loy ha'emantem bi, you did not believe in me, lahakdisheni le'eini b'nei Yisrael, to bring sanctification to my name before the Jewish people. God saw what Moses and Aaron, but primarily Moses, did with hitting the rock. It was an opportunity to sanctify God's name. He failed and he is punished. In other words, the verses make it clear that it's extremely severe. So why would you think that it shouldn't be as severe as the spies? In other words, if you look at the actual verses, it seems pretty severe. So the Rebbe doesn't buy that. The Rebbe doesn't buy that the point of Moshe inserting his own story with the rock was just to point out how severe it was. So then if that's the case, so then what is it all about? What is this insertion that Moshe made in the middle of someone else's story? And I think that's the point. What I'm about to explain really emphasizes the importance of clarity. It's so important to know. In Yiddish, we call it vuhin vuos. Not to bash and not to hurt people's feelings and not, God forbid, to be insensitive, which in Judaism is one of the most hurtful things. It's one of the most bashed things in Judaism, believe it or not. One of the most despised things is when we're insensitive to others. But clarity is important. So we have to figure out ways to be clear so that people don't make the same mistakes again. And clarity helps that without being insensitive and hurtful to other people. So Moshe is in the middle of telling a story. Moses is telling them a story it's a story of rebuke, and he's telling them the punishment of the generation of the desert. So again, he's talking to the Jews that are going into Israel. He's telling them that their ancestors are not going to end up in Israel. They already died, and you want to know why they died and why they're not going to Israel? Because of the story of the spies. And yet, from the story of the spies, you know who's going to go to Israel? Caleb is going to go to Israel. So why not just throw Joshua right into it? Why can't you just say Caleb is going to go into Israel and Joshua is going to lead the Jews into Israel? Says the Rebbe, he couldn't do that. Because why? Because the 5-year-old learning Chumash, right? The 5-year-old studying the Torah. Rashi comes to address 5-year-old children's questions. The 5-year-old learning Torah will initially ask himself or herself, why, if Caleb and Joshua are both the righteous ones from amongst the spies, why is Joshua leading the Jews into Israel? Why not Caleb? They were both righteous. What did Joshua do to earn that? Is he different? What makes him different than Caleb? So there had to be a pause. And the pause is to explain how, yes, they're both going to go, Caleb and Joshua will both go to Israel, but one of them needs to be a leader. Now, why do Jewish people need a leader? So Moshe had to say, by the way, because I'm not going. Why am I not going? Because of you. And you need to know that. Yes, I have my faults. Moshe was the humblest man to ever live. He never denied his faults. He never had a problem apologizing. We see this in the story of Tzlofchad's daughters, and with Korach, he never had a problem getting advice. When his father-in-law Jethro gave him advice, he listened. He had no issue with that. But he needed the Jews, the next generation going to Israel, to understand that there's a Caleb and there's a Joshua, and the reason we need a Joshua to lead, and by the way, the verse says it, Hu yanchilena es Yisrael, he will help the Jews inherit the land of Israel, or in the translation here, Joshua the son of Nun, who stands at your side, will go there, support him, for he will lead the Jewish people to inherit it. Why is he able to lead the Jewish people? Why is he chosen to lead the Jewish people into Israel? Because I can't. I can't because you guys put me in so many situations that eventually I dropped the ball. So I'm blaming you for some of it. I'm blaming myself for other parts of it. God got angry at me because of you, because you triggered this whole conversation about water. And therefore, I lost my chance to go into Israel. So therefore, Joshua, the other guy, there's Caleb. Oh, froze. Oh, there's Caleb. There's me who can't go in. Therefore, the other guy, Joshua, is going to lead you to inherit the land. So why did he say Biglalchem? Why did he say because of you? He was trying to make a point that it's not really because of the spies. It's because of the water episode, the water rights fight that we had just not too long ago. And so therefore, I need you to understand that. Don't blame your ancestors for the fact that I'm not going to Israel. You want to know why Josh was leading you into Israel? Because I can't. And it's not because of the story of the spies, like the other commentators tried to explain. Rashi doesn't accept that. Rashi accepts simplicity. I can't lead you into Israel because you guys, not the old generation, the new generation, got me caught up in this conflict over water, which resulted in me not being able to go to the land. So why would Moshe tell that to them? What was the point? Well, obviously, the most basic point is that Moshe Rabbeinu, being the leader with clarity that he was, needed them to know how not to make the same mistake. They're going to, right? He's telling them, I got banned from Israel because of you. Joshua's going to lead you into Israel, basically saying, please treat him nicer. Don't put him in such a way. And by the way, Joshua was treated a lot nicer. If you look at the book, if you ever want to study the book of Joshua, first of all, you don't have to be you don't need I'm going to say something that most rabbis, well, we'll leave it at that. You don't need a rabbi to teach you the book of Joshua. You can go buy an art scroll, book of Joshua, sit on your couch with a cup of coffee or tea. It's a fascinating book. I mean, I'm not saying it could hurt to have a rabbi, but if you buy the art scroll, there's so many commentators in English, and it's beautiful, and you can read it, and it's phenomenal. Because what's phenomenal is that it was one of the greatest times for all the trouble they had in the desert. This generation going into Israel at least took Moshe's message to heart for quite some time, where they literally followed Joshua without any issues, no hiccups. Occasionally there was an achon, a nudnik that made trouble, and he paid for it. But as a whole, it was a very peaceful, beautiful era for the Jewish people once they conquered the land from the enemies. Joshua had an incredible relationship with the people, probably because he had a Moshe that spent a lot of time infusing his leadership role to the Jewish people. And so obviously on a most basic level, Moshe inserted himself there, not because he needed to blame the Jews again. He needed them to understand why it was Joshua and not him that's taking him into Israel, and for them to understand that it was they had a part in that, and if they don't realize that, they'll make the same mistake again with Joshua. But there's another part to that from reading the Rebbe didn't say it in therapeutic terms, but I was reading it over and over and over, and I feel like I could take a little poetic liberty from what the Rebbe is writing, what the Rebbe is editing here from this talk in 1973, that there's an important aspect therapeutically for stating facts with clarity, even if it might sting a little bit, because in the long term, sugarcoating things or giving hints, right? A lot of if you look in the book of, in this portion itself, in Devarim, a lot of the rebuke that Moses gave to the Jews was with hints. A lot of it was clear. In other words, some of it's revealed, some of it's kind of cryptic. And thanks to Rashi and the Talmud, we know what he was referring to. But if you read the verses, there's a lot of cryptic rebuke and there's a lot of clear rebuke. And in this case, the rebuke was so specific and so clear, because sometimes for the sake of, making the person we're rebuking, obviously we're talking about rebuking with kindness and with sensitivity and in privacy and following all the halachas of rebuke. There's a lot of halachas in rebuke, and if you don't know them, be very careful. But even when doing it, sometimes we don't want to say it, in Hebrew we call it berachul bitcha aktana, right? Why when Jacob was trying to work for Laban to get Rachel as a wife, right? He says, I'm going to work for you for 7 years. And then he says, berachul bitcha aktana. Rachel, your daughter, the youngest one. Why did he have to say Rachel, your daughter, the youngest one? Because he said, if I say Rachel, he might say there's a different Rachel. So I said your daughter. But if I say your daughter, he might say, well, I meant the older daughter, not Rachel. So I said Aktana, the younger one. In other words, when you're dealing with Laban, you got to be very clear. So there's a term amongst Jews, amongst Talmudic Jews, Jews that know the lingo of the Talmud, when you want to say with clarity, you say, he told them, Rachel bitcha Aktana. With Rachel, his daughter, the youngest one. Now, if you just translate it, it makes no sense. But now that you know the context, it makes sense. So when it comes to rebuke, sometimes you don't want to say it with that kind of clarity because it's uncomfortable. And I'll tell you, as a rabbi, even recently, I've been put in situations where I had no choice. You have to confront people about issues, and they're awkward, they're uncomfortable, but it's the right thing to do. And if you try to say it in any other way, it's not without the clarity, it's not going to do justice, and it's not going to rectify the situation. And you need them to understand it so that they can fix it. So Moshe Rabbeinu, in his incredible love for his people, despite the fact that he was upset that he wasn't going to Israel, and he blamed them on some level for it, and he already surrendered to the fact that Joshua was going to lead them. He said, listen, guys, I'm not going to Israel. You guys have a part in that. And I need you to know that so you don't do this to Joshua. I'll tell you a story. When I was in 8th grade, when we were in 7th grade, my teacher's mother passed away. When we were in 8th grade, my teacher's mother passed away. So when it came to leaving 8th grade, the teacher said to us, don't kill the 9th grade teacher's mother, which we all took with a lot of humor. It was very funny. We still talk about it till today, our class. But there's something to be said about the clarity that's needed when talking to people, and not to create realities that will just perpetuate the negativity because no one ever said clearly what the issue was in the first place, right? And so I find so often that with the greatest intentions, people don't want to call a spade a spade. And there's a time for that. But when you're dealing with rectification, when you're dealing with tshuva, when you're dealing with people making changes in their life, if you want the changes to happen, you have to have the hard conversations. And when you do, whether it's spousal conversations, parent-child conversations, community members with their leader conversations, any real relationship conversation, you have to have tough conversations because at the end of the day, those changes will bring about a better tomorrow, a better future. But they can only bring that about if there's clarity on what the issue is. And I think Moshe Rabbeinu understood that, and he wanted this new generation of Jews going to Israel to understand that. And I take it as a sign of his, not of his toughness or his harshness, but quite the contrary. I see it in the context of everything else he shared with them as a sign of his sensitivity and his love for them, that they don't end up in the same place. They don't kill their 9th grade teacher's mother, right? They don't do to Joshua what they did to him. And in order to ensure that, he used that clarity and inserted it right between Caleb and Joshua, because there is a difference in Caleb and Joshua. Caleb only got to go to Israel and got a portion of the land. Joshua was the leader. And I think if we could take to heart a little bit more about clarity in our own lives, about helping those who we love. Generally, don't try to help people you don't love, especially not with words. It doesn't work, doesn't turn out well. But if it's people you love and you want to speak to them to help change them, you have to be clear, because that is the greatest expression of how much you care. I learned this, and I will say this, even though it's public, because I think I'm comfortable with it, and I'm honored by it. And that some of the greatest changes I've made in my life are because of Chavi. And the initial conversations of Chavi about these issues were not fun. They weren't fun to listen to. Who wants to hear the person that you love most give you constructive criticism or educate you or give you a new form of enlightenment and understanding about parenting or about, you name it? But long term, I look back, and I don't mean look back 20 years ago. I mean look back like last week, last month, and the changes and the perspective changes and the real hard work that goes into what creates progress in people's development and in their life comes through the clarity of being told the harsh things that initially are hard to hear. but long term, they do the best. And Moshe wanted the best for his people. So he gifted Yehoshua with a saner people, a healthier people. And that was because he cared about them more than about his own agenda and his own personal aggrandizement. And with that, I wish you all a meaningful 9 days, a meaningful Tisha B'Av. For those that don't know, Saturday night, or actually Saturday evening before Shabbos ends, if you need to know the exact times in your community, you can text me or message me. The fast of the 9th of Av begins and goes all the way till Sunday night. It is one of the two most important fasts. Yom Kippur and Tisha B'Av are the two most important fasts in Judaism. So if you can fast, obviously it's highly recommended. Some would say even obligatory. But you know, Hashem is a kol yachal. Hashem could do anything. Therefore, with His help, we won't have to have a fast on Sunday. We'll be celebrating all together in Yerushalayim HaKodesh with Moshe Rabbeinu. We'll be able to hang out with Moses and Aaron and the Rebbe, and we could sit at the table. And we won't come like ignoramuses. We'll sit down and say, hey, Moses, Aaron, Rebbe, Rashi, we'd like to have a discussion about this verse that refers to you guys and that we sat and spoke about on Wednesday night, but we won't have to fast. We'll say L'chaim, and we'll have a barbecue to celebrate the coming of Mashiach Tzidkenu. May it be speedily in our days. Amen. Have a rocking evening, a wonderful week, and it's great to see you all. Shalom, sei gesund.
Thank you, Rabbi. Good night.
Any questions on Zoom before I wrap it up? On all the platforms. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to take a
What's that weird English word that you use?
juxtaposition.
Yeah.
Kol beseder, Chagai. Beautiful hair.
אתה יודע מה זה TOT?
Tachas Aventish. Yeah. Good. You should have mentioned it in the middle of the class. I would have said it out loud.
Yeah, we don't want to interrupt you.
I would say that.
Very good. Laila Tov.
Okay,
Laila Tov.
bye-bye.
Maybe we'll see you on